Hello everyone, it's great to be here. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander custodians of the land from which I'm presenting today, the Bedigal and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who have inhabited the eastern suburbs of Sydney for many tens of thousands of years. I'd also like to thank the APA Division 15 award team and Division 15 for this opportunity to share some of my research with you. I'd also like to acknowledge my mentors and collaborators, including my PhD advisees, who have all played a major role in helping me develop as a researcher over the past few years. What I'd like to do today is to share two studies with you that provide a nice overview of two major lines of research in my work. And so the first study will look at teacher well-being, and the second study will look at students' social and emotional motivation. And so teacher well-being is a factor I've looked at for many years, and it's really important in the current climate because we do know there are high rates of burnout. We know that teachers' workloads have increased, and we also know that teaching work is becoming increasingly complex. And so understanding factors that support teachers at work is really important for teachers' own well-being, but also for students and schools. And so in our research, my colleagues and I have looked at a range of job resources and job demands that are linked with teacher outcomes. So what we know from job resources is that they are factors that help teachers undertake their work, whereas job demands are factors that hinder teachers and hinder their ability to do their job effectively. And so we know there are factors like autonomy, supportive leadership, helpful feedback, input in decision making, and relatedness with peers and colleagues that are really important for teacher wellbeing outcomes, including organisational commitment, occupational commitment, lower turnover intentions, and greater wellbeing, such as subjective vitality. And in turn, those findings are important for students because when teachers are experiencing wellbeing at work, it's linked with greater student achievement and also teachers' ability to create a more supportive learning environment. On the flip side, we then have job demands, and they include factors like autonomy thwarting leadership, disruptive student behaviour, and teachers' sense of time pressure. And we know that these factors are associated with lower wellbeing. Things like greater emotional exhaustion, greater turnover intentions, lower commitment, and lower adaptability and workplace buoyancy. Now, those findings there are summarising research looking at teachers. And more recently, we've started to examine what happens at the school level. Now, while we do have a beginning understanding of the role of job resources at the school level, we know less about the role of job demands. And so that's what my colleague Caroline Mansfield and I set out to do in this new study of ours that was published in Teaching and Teacher Education. And in particular, we looked at three types of stress, and then we used person-centered analyses to identify teacher-level profiles or teacher stress profiles. And so the first type of stress we examined was workload stress, and that involves stress from having too much lesson preparation, instruction, or marking work in the time available. We looked at student behaviour stress, which is stress from student behaviour that's unduly disruptive or aggressive. And we looked at expectation stress. So that's teacher stress from unrealistic expectations from evolving requirements, including compliance, and teachers' expectations. And then what we did was we looked at whether teachers' gender or teaching experience predict membership in the profiles. I'm not going to focus on those results today, but if you're interested, please see the manuscript. What I'm going to focus on is the links that different profiles have with two teacher-level outcomes. Work strain, which refers to teachers' negative psychological or physiological outcomes that result from stress at work, and occupational commitment, teachers' emotional or psychological attachment to their profession. Then next was we elevated that to the school level to identify school level profiles. And to do that in this manuscript, what we did is we identified how the different teacher profiles are distributed within schools. And then we grouped like schools with like schools to identify those profiles. Like at the teacher level, we then used school characteristics to predict membership, and then we looked at how the profiles are associated with school average strain and commitment among teachers. The sample involved over 3,000 teachers from 225 schools located in Australia, and these were teachers who participated in the Teaching and Learning International Survey, or TALIS, in 2018. We used single-level and multi-level latent profile analysis with factor scores. The reliabilities were adequate, as were the model fit indices, but please see full details in the manuscript if you're interested in the analytic approach. To give you an idea of what teachers were asked, here are some sample items. So thinking about your job at this school, to what extent are the following sources of stress in your work? And so, for example, for workload stress, having too much lesson preparation. And teachers were asked to agree or disagree with these statements. The outcomes, you can see for work strain there, my job negatively impacts my mental health, and for occupational commitment, the advantages of being a teacher clearly outweigh the disadvantages. Let's have a look at the results. So here we have 5 profiles. These were the 5 profiles that were identified among those teachers. That bar at 0 represents the sample-wide average. So when you see a column below that bar, it reflects below average stress, and vice versa for columns above the bar. And so what we see for that first profile on the left, the low burden profile, is that this type of teacher had low levels of the 3 sources of stress. Then we have these 2 mixed burden profiles, and they were quite interesting. So they both had below average levels of stress, but for the mixed burden workload profile, you can see that they had relatively higher workload stress. Whereas for the mixed burden behaviour profile, they had relatively higher student behaviour stress. Then we had the average burden profile and the high burden profile. And so what we see from this broad group of findings is that around 4 in 10 teachers had stress levels that were below average, 4 in 10 reported around average stress, and 2 in 10 reported high stress levels. Now when we look at links with the outcomes, we see for work strain that the low burden profile had the lowest work strain. This was followed by the mixed burden behaviour, that's in the purple, and then the mixed burden workload. And those 2 were significantly different, which is interesting. So this suggests that workload stress may be more detrimental to strain than student behaviour stress. And perhaps this is because workload is more likely to cross the work-life divide and impact teachers outside of work hours, whereas student behaviour stress may be more restricted, though not entirely, to school hours, allowing teachers time to recuperate after hours. The high burden profile reported the highest work strain. When we move to occupational commitment, you can see that the high burden profile had the lowest, whereas the low burden profile and the 2 mixed burden profiles had similar levels that were the highest levels for this outcome. When we move to the school level, you can see we found 3 school profiles. And so on the left, we call this profile the lower pressure climate workload, and that's because this group had a high proportion of workload stress oriented profiles. In the middle, we have the lower pressure climate behaviour school profile, and again, that's because this group had lots of behaviour stress oriented profiles. And then we have on the right hand side the higher pressure climate. So they were mostly high and average burden profiles. So 3 school profiles. Let's have a look at the outcomes. So what you can see here is that we see that the 2 lower pressure climate groups had below average work strain. They were not significantly different from one another after we controlled for school size and socioeconomic status. However, you can see that the higher pressure climate, that teachers in that school had much higher work strain. For occupational commitment, all comparisons were significantly different. So we see the lowest levels from the higher pressure climate and then the highest levels from the lower pressure climate behaviour. So what this study tells us is it gives us some understanding about job demands at the school level. But one notable finding that I want to draw your attention to is the differentiation between workload stress and student behaviour stress that we saw in 2 teacher profiles and 2 school profiles. And so we found that at some schools, the stress experiences of individuals mirrored that of the teaching staff more broadly. So some teachers and schools had high levels of workload stress, whereas other teachers and schools had high levels of behaviour stress. Now, what this tells us is that stress is not necessarily specific to individuals, but seems to reflect a broader stress climate as well. And that means that managing stress is not just the responsibility of individual teachers, schools, and educational systems more broadly. It can play an important role in developing workplaces that help to minimise teacher stress. So that was the first study. Moving on to the second one. And this one's looking at social and emotional motivation among adolescents, and in particular, the role of perceived competence in relation to social and emotional phenomena. And so perceived competence reflects the sense of being effective in one's interactions and undertakings. And perceived competence features in many motivation theories. Now, we know from decades worth of research that perceived academic competence promotes positive academic outcomes. And that's because individual development and action taking is mobilised by perceived competence. When individuals feel competent, they're more likely to be driven to act in accordance with that. In this study, the aim was to look at perceived social and emotional competence, or perceived SEC, which is the perception of being capable in intra and interpersonal social and emotional interactions. Now, there is a growing body of research looking at perceived SEC, and this has been examined by way of specific factors such as perceived competence for conflict resolution or self-efficacy for emotion regulation. Other studies have looked at a broader factor, so a higher order perceived social competence factor. And what we know from these emerging studies is that the separate factors and the higher order factor are linked with positive outcomes like greater well-being, more pro-social behaviour, greater autonomous pro-social motivation. Gaps do remain, however. Now, prior research has tended to examine only one or 2 types of perceived SEC, or a broad factor that rolls different types of perceived SEC into one. However, we know that social and emotional behaviours are multidimensional. So is there evidence for a wider range of perceived social and emotional competence dimensions? And are these dimensions specific constructs, a global construct, or both? So in the study I'm going to talk through today, 5 types of perceived SEC were examined. And you can see those there. Perceived SEC, or perceived competence for assertiveness, tolerance, social regulation, emotion regulation, and emotional awareness. And these 5 are not meant to be exhaustive. Different cultures and contexts call for different perceived social and emotional competencies and different skills. However, they do map onto skills noted in other models. And so we have Cassell's model of social and emotional skills, and you can see how these perceived SEC factors map onto those. And then more recently, the OECD has released a model organising social and emotional skills by way of the big 5 personality factors. Now, the major difference between Cassell and OECD and perceived SEC is that Cassell and OECD look at actual skills or behaviours, whereas perceived SEC is that sense of capability, that sense of competence. So the aim of this study was to examine whether the 5 factors of perceived SEC reflect specific constructs or a global factor, and to examine the hypothesized model, which you can see there. So we, using the specification identified in research question 1, to what extent is perceived SEC linked with motivation and in turn behaviours? And the behaviours were reported by parents, as were 2 of the background characteristics that served as covariate controls. So ADHD diagnosis and socioeconomic status were reported by parents. This study involved 414 Australian secondary school students and their parents. You can see some sample statistics there. To examine the perceived SEC specification, confirmatory factor analysis and exploratory structural equation modelling were used, followed by a bifactor counterpart. And then for main analyses, structural equation modelling was used. Again, please see the main manuscript for the full audit trail of the analytic approach. Here are some sample items. And so for perceived competence for assertiveness, I feel capable to make sure my ideas are heard in group work at school. And you can see the other constructs there. Items were scored on a 7-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. For motivation, students were given 4 stems, and there's 1 stem example there. I put effort into being someone who can be counted on by others, and then they responded agree to disagree based on different motivations reflecting the types of motivation as per self-determination theory. So for example, because I enjoy doing this reflects intrinsic motivation, whereas because otherwise I'll get in trouble if I'm unreliable, that reflects external motivation or extrinsic motivation. And then we have the behaviours, and these were parent reported using the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. What did the results show? So bifactor exploratory structural equation modelling was selected as the optimal structure. So the bifactor ESEM yielded better fit than the ESEM and the CFA. It had a well-defined global factor, relatively well-defined specific factors, and relatively smaller cross-loadings. And so what this shows is that there was a global factor reflecting a broader sense of competence related to social and emotional phenomena, as well as 5 specific factors reflecting unique aspects of perceived SEC. And both global and specific factors appear to offer unique information about students' perceived SEC. So let's have a look at the structural equation modelling results. So first of all, we're going to look at the global perceived SEC factor, and we see that it's linked with greater autonomous motivation, lower conduct problems, and greater pro-social behaviour. And for these findings, it's likely that individuals who feel more competent in their social and emotional experiences come to internally endorse the values and beliefs associated with adaptive social and emotional interactions, and this internalization encourages autonomous motivation, but also acting in ways that align with that. The study also showed a positive association between global perceived SEC and introjected motivation. And so it's possible here that global perceived SEC means that students are more attuned to the opinions of others, which is a developmental characteristic of adolescence, and might raise feelings of wanting to be perceived as a good person, which is part of the definition of introjected motivation. Alongside the global perceived SEC factor, 2 specific factors were associated with the motivation or behavioural outcomes. And so the first of these was perceived competence for tolerance, which was positively associated with autonomous motivation. And so perhaps for this finding, perhaps it occurred because perceived competence for tolerance is inherently imbued with social awareness and open-mindedness. And both of those are important for internalizing the interpersonal values that are associated with autonomous social and emotional motivation. The other specific factor that played an important role was social regulation. It was associated with lower external motivation and lower conduct problems. And perhaps these negative associations occurred because when you have a stronger social perceived competence for social regulation, you internalize the values of that, and so you're less likely to feel pressured to act in that way, which is external social and emotional motivation, and you're less likely to engage in actions that go against that sense of perceived competence. Now, this was important because this specific factor, predicted a behavioural outcome beyond the role of global perceived SEC. So it highlights just how important perceived competence for social regulation is for adolescents. In terms of links between the motivation factors and the behaviour factors, we saw a positive association between autonomous motivation and pro-social behaviour. There was also a significant indirect association there. And finally, we saw that external motivation was associated with greater conduct problems. So in terms of some takeaways, what we see is that global perceived SEC played the most consistent role. 2 of the specific factors were associated with outcomes beyond the role of global perceived SEC as well. And an important question for future research is, do the other specific factors play a role or have links with other outcomes? Now, more broadly, given what we know about academic motivation, perceived SEC appears to be something schools and intervention developers may want to consider in efforts to boost social and emotional development among adolescents. And so, to conclude, I think it's important to make some links between the two studies that I shared. As a former primary school teacher, I saw firsthand just how important social and emotional skills are for students to succeed academically and in terms of their well-being. I also witnessed just how debilitating impaired teacher well-being can be for a classroom and school. Now, since embarking on my research program, the field of educational psychology has helped me to better understand just how much social and emotional phenomena matter. And today I've shared two studies that get at social and emotional factors relevant to teachers and students. And I want to end by saying that these factors are linked. When we create supportive learning and working environments for students and teachers, we help to promote positive academic, social and emotional, and occupational outcomes. Thank you very much for joining me today. I've really appreciated the opportunity to share some of this research, and the two studies I shared today are available on my ResearchGate profile, or please feel free to email me. Thank you.